Volume 1, Chapter 13 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Thou takest not away, O Death. Thou strikest, absence perisheth, indifference is no more. The future brightens on our sight, for on the past hath fallen a light that tempts us to adore. While Juanita clung with feverish intensity to the hope of discovering her husband's murderer, Lord Cheriton seemed to be gradually resigning himself to the idea that the crime would go to swell the long list of undiscovered murders which he could recall within his own experience of life; crimes which had kept society expectant and on the alert for a month, and which had stimulated the police to unwonted exertions, finally to fade into oblivion or to be occasionally cited as an example of the mysteriousness of human history. He had offered a large reward. He had brought all his own trained intelligence to bear upon the subject. He had thought and brooded upon it by day and by night, and the result had been nil. A hand had been stretched out of the darkness to slay an unoffending young man, in whose life his daughter's happiness had been bound up. That was the whole history of the murder. A shot heard in the night, a bullet fired out of the darkness with fatal aim. Not one indication, not one suggestive fact had been discovered since the night of the murder. "It is hopeless," said Lord Cheriton, talking over the calamity with Mr. Scarsdale, the vicar of Cheriton and Testwick, adjoining parishes. "The crime and the motive of the crime are alike inscrutable. If one could imagine a reason for the act it might be easier to get upon the track of the murderer; but there is no reason that I can conceive for such a deed. It has been suggested to me that Sir Godfrey might have had a secret enemy, that his life might not have been as spotless as we think." "I will answer for it that he was never guilty of a dishonourable action, that he provoked no man's hatred by any unworthy act," interrupted the vicar warmly. He had been curate at Millbrook before he got the Cheriton living, and had lived for 2 years at the Priory while he prepared Godfrey Carmichael for Eton, so he claimed the right to vouch for the honour of the dead. "There never was a whiter soul in mortal clay," said the vicar. "I am inclined to estimate his character almost as highly as you," replied Lord Cheriton deliberately; "yet the straightest walker may make one false step; and there may have been some unfortunate entanglement at the University, or in London." "I will never believe it. He may have been tempted; he may have yielded to temptation, but if he erred, be sure he atoned for his error to the uttermost of his power. There are errors, seeming light to the steps that stumble, which cannot be atoned for. There was no such error in his youth. I looked in his face on his wedding day, Lord Cheriton, and it was the face of a man of unblemished life, a man who need fear no ghost out of the dead past. Well, you are right, I believe, and in that case the murder is motiveless, the murder of a madman so profoundly artful in his lunacy as to escape every eye. By heaven, I wish we had the old way of hunting such a quarry, and that a leash of bloodhounds could have been set loose upon his track within an hour of the murder. They would have hunted him down. Their instinct would have found him skulking and shivering in his lair, and we should have needed no astute detective primed with all the traditions of Scotland Yard. It would have been swift, sudden justice, blood for blood." His dark eyes shone with an angry light as he walked up and down the spacious floor of the library, while the vicar stood in front of the fire, looking gravely into his clerical hat, and without any suggestion to offer. "I hope Lady Carmichael is recovering her spirits," he said feebly after a pause. "She is not any happier than she was when her loss was a week old; but she keeps up in a wonderful way. I believe she is sustained by some wild notion that the murderer will be found, that she will live to see her husband's death avenged. I doubt if at present she has any other interest in life. But let us hope she will be cheered by the society of her husband's people. I hear that the Morningsides and the Grenvilles are to be at the Priory in November. Indeed, I have heard nothing about it. I was at Swanage yesterday afternoon, and took tea with Lady Jane. She was full of praises of Lady Carmichael's goodness, and her desire that all things at the Priory must be just as they had been in Sir Godfrey's lifetime. His brothers-in-law used to be invited for the shooting in November, and they were to be invited this year, on condition that Lady Jane would help to entertain them, and Lady Jane has consented gladly. So there will be a large family party at the Priory on this side of Christmas," concluded the vicar. "I am glad to hear it," said Lord Cheriton. "Anything is better for her than solitude. Any occupation, if it be only revising a bill of fare, or listening to feminine twaddle, is better for her than idleness." "Yes, there will be a houseful," pursued the Vicar. "Mrs. Grenville takes her nursery with her wherever she goes." "And Mrs. Morningside is delighted to leave hers behind her." "Yes, she is one of those mothers who are always telling people what paragons of nurses Providence has provided for their darlings, or how admirably their children are being brought up by a model governess," said the Vicar, who was severe upon other people's neglect of duty. "By the by, talking of mothers, I believe I saw Mrs. Porter's daughter the other day while I was in town." "You believe you saw her?" "Yes, I am not certain. A face flashed past me in the street one night, and when the face was gone it came upon me that it was Mercy Porter's eyes that looked at me for an instant in the gaslight. I was in a busy thoroughfare on the Surrey side of Westminster Bridge. I had been to hear Vansittart preach a mission sermon at the church near Walworth, and I was walking back to the West End. It was late on a Saturday night, and the road was full of costermongers' barrows, and the pavement was crowded with working people doing their marketing. I tried to overtake the girl whose face had startled me, but it was no use. She had melted into the crowd. I went back the whole length of the street, hoping I might find her in front of one of the costers' stalls, but she must have turned into one of the numerous side streets, and it was hopeless to hunt for her there. Yet I should have been very glad to get hold of her." "Is she much changed?" "Changed? Yes. It was only the ghost of Mercy Porter that I saw. I should not have known her but for her eyes. She had fine eyes, do you remember, and with a great deal of expression in them. I think I should be safe in swearing to Mercy Porter's eyes." "Did she look poor or ill?" "She looked both, but the illness might be only hunger. She had that wan, pinched look one sees in the faces of the London poor, especially in the women's faces." "Have you told her mother?" "No, I came to the conclusion that it would be giving the poor soul useless pain to tell her anything, having so little to tell. She knew years ago that Colonel Tremaine had deserted his victim, and that the girl had dropped through — God knows where — into the abyss that swallows up handsome young women who begin their career in West End lodgings and a hired brougham. If the mother were to go in quest of her, and bring her home here, it might be only to bring shame and misery upon her declining years. The creature may have fallen too low for the possibility of reformation, and the mother's last hours might be darkened by her sin. I would do much to rescue her, but I would rather try to save her through a stranger's help than by the mother's intervention." Lord Cheriton continued his pacing to and fro, and did not appear particularly interested in the case of Mercy Porter. He had been much troubled by her flight from Cheriton, for the seducer was his own familiar friend, and he had felt himself in some wise to blame for having brought such a man to Cheriton. He told himself that he would not have had Tremaine inside his house had his own daughter been out of the schoolroom; and yet he had allowed the man to cross the path of the widow's only child, and to bring desolation and sorrow upon the woman whose life he had in somewise taken under his protection. "There are people whose mission it is to hunt out that kind of misery," he said, after an interval of silence. "I hope one of those good women will rescue Mercy Porter. I think you have been wise in saying nothing to the mother. She has got over her trouble, and anything she might hear about the girl would be a reopening of old wounds." "She is a wonderful woman," replied the Vicar. "I never saw such grief as hers when the girl ran away; and yet within a few months she had calmed down into the placid personage she has been ever since. She is a woman of very powerful mind. I sometimes wonder that even at her age she can content herself with the monotonous life she leads in that cottage." "Oh, she likes the place, I believe, and the life suits her," said Lord Cheriton carelessly. "She had seen a good deal of trouble before she came here, and this was a quiet haven for her after the storms of life. I am very sorry the daughter went wrong," he added, with a sudden cloud upon his face. "That was a bitter blow, and I shall never forgive myself for having brought that scoundrel Tremaine here." "He is dead, is he not?" "Yes. He was killed in Afghanistan 6 years ago. He was a good soldier, though he was a bad man. I daresay he made his being ordered off to India an excuse for leaving Mercy — left her with a trifle of money, perhaps, and a promise of further remittances, and then let her drift. I told my lawyer to keep his eye upon her, if possible, and to establish her in some respectable calling if ever he saw the chance of doing so; but she eluded him somehow, as you know.
Yes, you told me what you had done. It was like you to think even of so remote a claim upon your generosity." "Oh, she belonged to Cheriton. I have cultivated the patriarchal feeling as much as I can. All who live upon my land are under my protection. Lady Cheriton has been a good friend to Mrs. Porter, too. My wife is always kind."
Juanita accepted her cousin's account of what he had heard and read at St. Heliers, as the closing of his researches in the history of the Strangways. The sister's death in a shabby exile remained to be traced, but there was no light to be expected there, and Juanita felt that she must now submit to surrender her superstition about that evil race. It was not from them the blow had come. The murderer had to be hunted for in a wider range, and the quest would be more difficult than she had thought. She was not the less intent upon discovery because of this difficulty. "I have all my life before me," she told herself, "and I have nothing to live for but to see his murderer punished." It had been Juanita's especial desire that the Morningsides and the Grenvilles should be invited to the Priory just as they had been in Sir Godfrey's lifetime; that all the habits of the household should be as he had willed them when his bodily presence was there among them, as he was now in the spirit to Juanita's imagination. She thought of him every hour of the day, and in all things deferred to his opinions and ideas, shaping the whole course of her life to please him who was lying in that dark resting place where there is neither pain nor pleasure. When November came, however, and with it the troop of Grenvilles, nurses and nursery governess, and the Morningsides with valet and maid, it seemed to Juanita as if the wild companions of Comus or a contingent from Bedlam had invaded the sober old Priory. Those loud voices in the hall, that perpetual running up and down and talking and laughing upon the staircase, the everlasting opening and shutting of doors, the roll of carriage wheels driving up to the door a dozen times in a day, the bustle and fuss and commotion which two cheerful families in rude health can contrive to make in a house where they feel themselves perfectly at home, all these things were agonizing to the mourner who had lived in silence and shadow from the hour of her loss until now. Happily, however, Lady Jane was there to take all the burden off those weary shoulders; and Lady Jane, in the character of a grandmother, was in her very fittest sphere. Between her ladyship and the housekeeper all arrangements were made, and every detail was attended to without inflicting the slightest trouble upon Juanita. "You shall see just as little of them all as you like, dear," said Lady Jane. "You can breakfast and lunch in your morning room, and just come down to dinner when you feel equal to being with us, and then you will see the darlings at dessert. I know they will cheer you with their pretty little ways. Such loving pets as they are, too, and so full of intelligence. Did I tell you what Johnnie said yesterday at lunch?" "Yes, dear Lady Jane, you did tell me. It was very funny," replied Juanita, with a faint smile. She could not tell that adoring grandmother that the children were a burden to her, and that those intelligent speeches and delightful mispronunciations of polysyllabic words which convulsed parents and grandparent seemed to add perceptibly to her own gloom. She pretended to be interested in Tom's letter from Eton, with a modest request for a large hamper, and she made a martyr of herself by showing Susie picture books, and explaining the pictures, or by telling Lucy her favourite Hans Andersen story, which never palled upon that young listener. "Don't you think you would like a new one?" Juanita would ask. "No, no, not a new one. The same, please. I want the Proud Darning Needle." So the adventures of the Proud Darning Needle had to be read or related as the case might be. Juanita took Lady Jane's advice and spent the greater part of every day in her morning room, that room which had been Godfrey's den. It was further from the staircase than any other sitting room, and the clatter and the shrill voices were somewhat modified by distance. The house party amused themselves after their heart's desire, and worked the horses with the true metropolitan feeling that a horse is an animal designed for locomotion, and that he can't have too much of it. Lady Jane was the most indulgent of deputy hostesses, and spent all breakfast time in cutting sandwiches of a particularly dainty kind for her sons-in-law, so that they might be sustained between the luxurious home breakfast at 9, and the copious luncheon with which the cart met the shooters by appointment at 1:30. When the shooters had started there were the little Grenvilles to slave for, and Lady Jane spent another half hour in seeing them off upon their morning constitutional, Lucy on her Shetland, and Johnnie, Susie, and Godolphin on their short little legs with groom and nurses in attendance. There were so many wraps to be adjusted,
So many injunctions to be given to nurses and groom, so many little pockets to be filled with gingerbreads and queen cakes, while Mrs. Grenville looked on, and protested against grandmamma's infraction of hygienic rules. Dr. Dobson Drew's had said they must never eat between meals. Juanita rarely appeared before afternoon tea, when she was generally installed in her own particular easy chair by the fire, fenced round by a 7-leaved Indian screen, which was big enough to include a couple of small tables and a creepy stool, before the sisters-in-law came in from their afternoon drive, or the shooters dropped in after their day in the woods. There were no other guests than the sisters and their husbands, and it was an understood thing that no one else should be asked, unless it were Lord and Lady Cheriton, the Dalbrooks from Dorchester, or Mr. Scarsdale. No one could have been sweeter than the young widow was to her visitors during the hours she spent with them, listening with inexhaustible patience to Jessica Grenville's graphic account of the measles as lately taken by her whole brood, with all the after consequences of the malady, and the amount of cod liver oil and quinine consumed by each patient, pretending to be interested in Ruth Morningside's perpetual disquisitions upon smart people and smart people's frocks, and in every way performing her duty as a hostess. And yet George Grenville was not altogether satisfied. "I'll tell you what it is, Jess," he said to his wife one night, in the luxurious privacy of the good old-fashioned bedroom, seated on the capacious sofa in front of the monumental four-poster, with elaborately turned columns, richly moulded cornice, and heavy damask curtains, the kind of bedstead for which our ancestors gave 50 guineas, and for which no modern auctioneer can obtain a bid of 50 shillings. "I'll tell you what it is, Jess," repeated Mr. Grenville, frowning at the fire, "either your brother's widow gives herself confounded airs, or there is something in the wind." "I'm afraid so, George," replied his wife meekly. "You're afraid of what? Why the deuce can't you be coherent? Afraid of her airs?" "I'm afraid there is something in the wind," faltered the submissive lady. "I suppose it's the best thing that could happen to her, poor girl, for a nursery will be an occupation for her mind, and prevent her brooding on her loss, but this place would have been very nice for Tom all the same." "I should think it would indeed, and he ought not be swindled out of it," said Mr. Grenville, with a disgusted air. I am surprised at your sister-in-law. I have always considered that there is a kind of indelicacy in a posthumous child. It may be a prejudice on my part, but I have always felt a sort of revulsion when I have heard of such creatures," and Mr. Grenville curled his lordly aquiline nose, and made a wry face at the jovial fire blazing hospitably, heaped high with coals and wood, and roaring up towards the frosty sky. CHAPter 14. Volume 1, Chapter 14 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Then through my brain the thought did pass, even as a flash of lightning there, that there was something in her air which would not doom me to despair, and on the thought my words broke forth. Harrington Dalbrook was as keenly impressed with a sense of stupendous self-sacrifice in giving up his prospects in the Church as if the primacy had only been a question of time. Yet as his divinity examination had twice ended in disappointment, and a shamefaced return to the paternal roof tree, it might be thought that, in his friend Sir Henry Baldwin's phraseology, he was very well out of it. Sir Henry was the average young man of the epoch, sharp, shallow, and with a strong belief in his own superiority to the human race in general, and naturally to a friend whose father plodded over leases and agreements in an old-fashioned office in a country town. But the two young men happened to have been thrown together at Oxford, where Sir Henry was at Christ Church, while Harrington Dalbrook was at New; and as Sir Henry's ancestral home was within 6 miles of Dorchester, the friendship begun at the University was continued in the county town. Sir Henry lived at a good old Georgian house called the Mount, between Dorchester and Weymouth. It was a red brick house, with a centre and 2 wings, a Corinthian portico of Portland stone, and a wide level lawn in front of the portico that was brilliant with scarlet geraniums all the summer. There were no novelties in the way of gardening at the Mount, and there were never likely to be any new departures while Lady Baldwin held the reins of power. She was known in the locality as a lady of remarkable closeness, a lady who pared down every department of expenditure to the very bone. The gardens and shrubberies were always in perfect order, neat, trim, weedless; but everything was reduced to the minimum of outlay. There were no new plants or shrubs, no specimen trees, no innovations or improvements.
There was very little glass, and there were only 2 gardeners to do the work in grounds for which most people would have kept 4 or 5. The dowager was never ashamed to allude to the smallness of her jointure or to bemoan her son's college debts. She had 2 daughters, a younger pale, sickly, and insignificant; the elder tall and large, with a beauty of the showy and high-colored order, brown eyes, a complexion of milk and roses, freely sprinkled with freckles, and light wavy hair, which in a young woman of meaner station might have been called red. The neighbourhood was of opinion that it was time for the elder Miss Baldwin to marry, and that she ought to marry well; but that important factor in marriage, the bridegroom, was not forthcoming. It was a ground of complaint against Sir Henry that he never brought any eligible young men to the Mount. "My mother's housekeeping would frighten them away if I did," answered Henry, when hard driven upon this point. "The young men of the present day like a good dinner. There isn't a third-rate club in London where the half-crown house dinner isn't better than the food we have here, better cooked and more plentiful." "Perhaps if you helped mother a little things would be more comfortable than they are," remonstrated Laura, the younger sister, who generally took upon herself the part of mentor. "You must know that her income isn't enough to keep up this place as it ought to be kept." "I don't know anything of the kind. I believe she is hoarding and scraping for you 2 girls. But she'll find by and by that she has been penny wise and pound foolish, for nobody worth having will ever propose to Juliet in such a dismal hole as this," continued the baronet, scornfully surveying the old-fashioned furniture, which had never been vivified by modern frivolities or made more luxurious by modern inventions. "Juliet is not the beginning and end of our lives," replied Laura sourly. "She has plenty of opportunities if she were only capable of using them. I know her visiting costs a small fortune." "A very small one," said Juliet. "I have fewer gowns than any girl I meet, and have to give smaller tips when I am leaving. The servants are hardly civil to me when I go back to a house." "I daresay not," retorted Laura, "considering that you expect other people's maids to do more for you than your own maid would do, if you had one." Juliet sighed and shrugged her graceful shoulders. "It is all very horrid and very sordid," she said, "and I wish I were dead." "I don't go so far as that," replied Laura, "but I wish with all my heart you were married, and that mother and I could live in peace." All this meant that the handsome Miss Baldwin was 27, and that although she had drunk the cup of praise from men and women, not one eligible man with place and fortune to offer had offered himself. Eligible men had admired, and had praised, and had flattered, and had ridden away, like the knight of old, and had married some other girl — a girl with money generally, an American girl sometimes. Juliet Baldwin hated the very name of Columbus. For want of some one better to flirt with, Juliet had flirted with Harrington Dalbrook. He was her junior by 2 years, and on his first visit to the Mount had succumbed to her beauty, and to the charm of manners which somewhat exaggerated the progressive spirit of the smart world. Miss Baldwin was amused by her conquest, though she had no idea of allowing her acquaintance with her brother's friend to travel beyond the strictest limits of that state of things which our neighbours call flirtage. But flirtage nowadays is somewhat comprehensive, and with Juliet it went so far as to allow her admirer to gratify her with offerings of gloves and flowers for her ball dresses when she was staying with friends in Belgravia, and the young man was taking a holiday in London. It may be said that the fascinations of this young lady had something to do with Harrington's failure to pass his divinity examination, and with his subsequent renunciation of the Church of England for the wider faith of the naturalist and the metaphysician. He told his family that he had got beyond Christianity as it was understood by churchmen, and set forth in the 39 Articles. He had gone from the river to the sea, as he explained it, from the narrow banked-in river of orthodoxy to the wide ocean of the new faith, faith in humanity, faith in a universal brotherhood, faith in oneself as superior to anything else in the universe, past or present. In this enlightened attitude he had grasped at Theodore's offer, all the more eagerly perhaps because he had lately heard Juliet Baldwin's emphatic declaration, apropos to nothing particular, that she would never marry a parson, and that the existence of a parson's wife in town or country seemed to her of all lives the most odious. Would she take more kindly to a lawyer, he asked himself, with a sinking heart? Would a country practice, life in an old-fashioned house in an old-fashioned market town satisfy her ambition? He feared not. If he wanted that radiant creature for his wife, He must exchange country for town, Dorchester for Lincoln's Inn Fields, and a house in Chester Street, or at least Gloucester Place. She had been used to Belgravia; but she might perhaps tolerate the neighbourhood of Portman Square, the unaristocratic sound of Baker Street, the convenience of Atlas omnibuses, until he should be able to start his brougham. Led on by this guiding star, he told himself that what he had to do was to become learned in the law, particularly in the science, art, and mystery of conveyancing, which branch of a family practice he believed to be at once dignified and lucrative. He had to make himself master of his profession, to make his experiments upon the inferior clay of Dorsetshire, upon farmers and small gentry, and then to persuade his father to buy him a London practice, an aristocratic London practice, such as should not call a blush to the cheek of a fashionable wife. He had met solicitors' wives who gave themselves all the airs of great ladies, and who talked as if the bench and the bar were set in motion and kept going by their husbands. Such a wife would Juliet be could he be so blessed as to win her. The mild flirtage, involving much tribute from the glover and the florist, the bookseller and the photographer, had been going on for nearly 3 years, and Harrington was tremendously in earnest. His sisters had encouraged him in his infatuation, thinking that it would be rather a nice thing to have a baronet as a family connection, and with a sneaking admiration for Sir Henry Baldwin's clubhouse manners and slangy vocabulary, which had to be translated to them in the first instance by Harrington. They liked to be intimate with Miss Baldwin of the Mount, liked to see her smart little pony cart waiting for an hour in front of the door in Cornhill, while the young lady prattled about her conquests, her frocks, and her parties over the afternoon tea table. True that she never talked about anybody but herself, except when she depreciated a rival belle; but the background of her talk was the smart world, and that was a world of which Janet and her sister loved to hear, albeit plain living and high thinking was their motto. Sir Henry had a small hunting stud, and somewhat ungraciously allowed his elder sister an occasional mount, although, as he took care to impress upon her, he hated hunting women. For the pleasure of being in the young lady's society, Harrington, who had no passion for horsemanship, became all of a sudden an ardent sportsman, borrowed his brother's cob, Peter, and was ultimately cajoled into the purchase of an elderly hunter, which was not quite quick enough for his friend Sir Henry. "You don't mean hunting in the shires, so pace is not of so much consequence to you as it is to me," said the baronet. "Mahmud will carry you beautifully in our country, and he's as quiet as a sheep." It is possible that this qualification of sheepishness was Mahmud's chief merit in Harrington's estimation. He was a black horse, and looked a good deal for the money. Sir Henry asked 100 guineas for him, and finally took his friend's acceptance for 80, and this transaction was the first burden of debt which Harrington Dalbrook laid upon his shoulders after leaving the University. There had been college debts, and he had considerably exceeded a very liberal allowance, but his father had paid those debts to the last shilling; and one grave and stern remonstrance, with a few fatherly words of advice for the future, had been all that Harrington had been called upon to endure. But he did not forget that his father had warned him against the consequences of any future folly. He felt rather uncomfortable when the black horse was brought to the door one hunting morning, and when his father happened to be in the front office, whence he could see the unknown animal. "Where did you get that black horse, Harrington? Is it a hire?" he asked. "No, the fact is I've bought him." "Have you really? You must be richer than I gave you credit for being if you can afford to buy yourself a hunter. He looks a well-bred one, but shows work. I hope you didn't give much for him." "No, I got him on easy terms." "Not on credit, I hope." "No, of course not. Sir Henry Baldwin sold him to me. I have saved a little out of my allowance, don't you know." "I'm very glad to hear it. And now be off, and get a good day's sport if you can. I shall want you to stick to your desk to morrow." Harrington took up his crop and hurried out, with a heart as heavy as lead. Never until to day had he told his father a deliberate falsehood; but Matthew Dalbrook's searching look had frightened him out of his veracity. Only 6 months ago he had solemnly pledged himself to avoid debt, and he had broken his promise already, and owed 80 guineas for a beast which he could hardly hope to ride to hounds half a dozen times that season. He had involved himself for the beast's maintenance also, for his father's stables were full, and he had been obliged to put this new animal out at livery. He began to feel now that he had made a fool of himself, that he had been talked into buying a horse for which he had very little use. He was jogging along in a low spirited way when Sir Henry and his sister came up behind him at a sharp trot, whereat Mahmud gave a buck jump that almost unseated him. " The black looks a trifle fresh this morning," said Sir Henry. " You'll take it out of him presently. He suits you capitally, and he's well up to your weight. I was a little bit too heavy for him. You'll find him go like old boots." Miss Baldwin, flushed with fresh air and exercise, looked more than usually brilliant. She was particularly amiable, too, and when Harrington complained that he might not be able to give Mahmud enough work she offered to meet the difficulty. " Send him over to me whenever you don't want him," she said cheerily. " I'll make him handy for you." The black gave another buck jump, and Harrington felt inclined to lay him at her feet there and then. It was only the remembrance of that horrid slip of stamped paper which had doubtless already been turned into cash by Sir Henry which restrained him. He made up his mind to send Mahmud to Tattersall's at the end of the hunting season to be sold without reserve. Juliet was riding a thoroughbred of which she was particularly fond, and was in very high spirits during the earlier part of the day, and in her lively society Harrington forgot the stamped paper, and gradually got on good terms with his horse. Mahmud had, indeed, no fault but age. He knew a great deal better how to keep near the hounds than his new master, and promised to be a valuable acquisition. Harrington felt that he was distinguishing himself. " The black suits you down to the ground," shouted Sir Henry in the middle of a run, as he bucketed past his friend upon a pulling chestnut that had no respect for anybody, but clove his way through the ruck of riders like a battering ram. Sir Henry boasted of this animal that he never kicked a hound. " Small thanks to him," said the master, " for he kicks everything else. Hounds are not good enough for him. He nearly smashed my leg last Monday." Harrington and Juliet did a good deal of quiet flirtation while the hounds were drawing a spinney rather late in the day, after a very good run and a kill. He told her all about the change in his position, and that he was to be his father's partner after a very short apprenticeship to the law. " And you will live in Dorchester all your life," said Juliet, with an involuntary disgust. " Not if I can help it. I don't mean to vegetate in a dead alive provincial town. My father has a London connection already, and all his business wants is a little new blood. I hope to start chambers in Lincoln's Inn Fields before I am many years older. And if I should marry," he continued, faltering a little, " I could afford to have a house in the West End — Mayfair or Belgravia, for instance." " Let it be Mayfair, I beg, for your wife's sake, whoever she may be," exclaimed Juliet lightly. " A small house in Belgravia is an abomination. There is an atmosphere of invincible dreariness throughout that district which can only be redeemed by wealth and splendour. Perhaps it is because the place is on a level with Millbank. There is a flavour of the prison in the very air. Now in Curzon or Hertford Street one breathes the air of the Park in Piccadilly, and one could exist in a bandbox. But really now, Harrington, joking apart, is it not rather wild in a young man like you — not out of paternal leading strings — to talk about marriage and housekeeping? One can't help thinking of the future. Besides, I am not so very young. I am 24. Juliet laughed a short cynical laugh, which ended in a sigh. She wondered whether he knew that she was 3 years older. Brothers are such traitors. " I am 24, and I feel that it is in me to succeed," concluded Harrington, with a comfortable vanity which he mistook for the self-confidence of genius. The hounds drew blank, and the riders jogged homewards presently, by lane and common, Sir Henry keeping in front with one of his particular friends, and talking horseflesh all the way, while Juliet and Harrington followed slowly side by side in earnest conversation. He told her the history of his doubts, about which she did not care twopence — his phases of faith and feeling, as he expressed it alliteratively. All she wanted to know was about his prospects — whether his father was as well off as he was said to be. She had heard people talk of him as a very rich man — those officious people who are always calculating other people's incomes, and descanting upon the little their neighbours spend, and the much that they must contrive to save. Juliet had heard a good deal of this kind of talk about Matthew Dalbrook, whose unpretentious and somewhat old fashioned style of living gave an impression of reserved force — wealth invested and accumulating for a smarter generation. After all, perhaps this young man, whose adoration was obvious, might not be a despicable parti. He might be pretty well off by and by, with a fourth, or better than a fourth, share of Matthew Dalbrook's scrapings, and he was Lord Cheriton's cousin, and therefore could hardly be called a nobody. Moved by these considerations, gravely weighed in the grave and grey November dusk, as they rode slowly between tall hedges, leafy still, but sere and red with the frost, Juliet felt inclined to let herself be engaged to her legal lover. She had been engaged to several people since she danced at her first ball. The bond did not count for very much in her mind. One could always slip out of that kind of thing, if it became inconvenient. One could manage with such tact that the man himself cried off, if one were afraid of being denounced as a jilt. Juliet and her lovers had always parted friends, and she wore more than one half hoop of sapphires or of brilliants which had once played a solemn part as her engagement ring, but which had lapsed into a souvenir of friendship. She was not so foolish as to hasten matters. She wanted to see her way before her, and she opposed Harrington's youthful ardour with the calm savoir faire of 27. She called him a foolish boy, and declared that they must cease to be friends if he insisted upon talking nonsense. She would have to accept a very urgent invitation to Lady Balgownie Briggs's castle in Scotland, which she had been fencing with for years, if he made it difficult for them to meet. She threw him into a state of abject alarm by this stupendous threat. "I won't say a word you can take objection to," he protested, "though I can't think why you should object." "You forget that I have to study other people's ideas as well as my own," she answered gently. "I hope you won't be offended if I tell you that my mother would never speak to me again if I were engaged to you." "No doubt Lady Baldwin has higher views," the young man said meekly. "Much higher views. My poor mother belongs to the old school. She cannot forget that her grandfather was a marquis. It is foolish, but I suppose it is human nature. Don't let us talk any more about this nonsense. I like you very much as my brother's friend, and I shall go on liking you if you don't make me unhappy by talking nonsense." Harrington took comfort from that one word, unhappy. It implied depths of feeling beneath that fashionable manner which held him at arm's length. His spirits were somewhat dashed presently when Miss Baldwin looked with friendly contemptuousness at his neat heather mixture coat and mud-stained white cords, and said carelessly, "It's a pity you don't belong to the hunt. I fancy you would look rather nice in pink." I have so lately given up the idea of the church," he faltered. "Yes, but now you have given it up you ought to be a member of the hunt. Let my brother put you up at the next meeting. You are pretty sure of being elected, and then you can order your pink swallow tail coat in time for the hunt ball in December." Harrington shivered. That would mean 2 red coats, a hunting coat and a dancing coat. But this idea of £20 laid out upon coats was not the worst. 20 years ago, when he had ridden as hard and kept as good horses as any member of the hunt, Matthew Dalbrook had resolutely declined the honour of membership. He had considered that a provincial solicitor had other work than ride to hounds 2 or 3 times a week. He might allow himself that pleasure now and again as an occasional relaxation in a hard-working professional life; but it was not for him to spend long days tearing about the country with the men of whose lands and interests he was in some wise custodian. Theodore, who was at heart much more of a sportsman than his younger brother, had respected his father's old-fashioned prejudices, whatever line they took, and he had never allowed his name to be put up for the hunt. He had subscribed liberally to the fund for contingent expenses, as his father and grandfather had done before him; but he had been content to forego the glory of a scarlet coat and the privilege of the hunt buttons. Harrington was not strong in that chief virtue of man, moral courage, the modern and loftier equivalent for that brute courage which was the Roman's only idea of virtue. He felt that to acknowledge himself afraid to put up for election into the sacred circle of the hunt, lest he should offend his father, was to own by implication that a solicitor was not quite upon the social level of landed gentry and retired military men, the colonels and majors who form the chief ornament of the average hunt club. He murmured something to the effect that his father was not sporting, and wouldn't like him to waste too much time riding to hounds. "What does that matter?" exclaimed Juliet. "You needn't go out any oftener because you are a member of the hunt. There are men who appear scarcely half a dozen times in a season — men who have left the neighbourhood, and only come down for a run now and then for old sake's sake." "I'll think it over," faltered Harrington. "Don't say anything to Sir Henry about it just yet." "As you please.
but I shan't dance with you at the ball if you wear a black coat," said Juliet, giving her bridle a sharp little shake and trotting forward to join her brother. Mahmud, discomposed by that sudden start, gave a shambling elderly shy. Harrington pulled him up into a walk and rode sulkily on, and allowed the other three riders to melt from him in the shades of the evening. Yes, she was beautiful exceedingly, and it would be promotion for a country solicitor to be engaged to a girl of such high standing, but he felt that his relations with her were hedged round with difficulty. She was expensive herself and a cause of expense in others. She had spent the brightest years of her girlhood in visiting in country houses, where everything was on a grander scale than at the Mount. She had escaped from the barrenness of home to the mansions of noblemen and millionaires. She had strained all her energies towards one aim, to be popular and to be asked to good houses. She had run the gauntlet of most of the best smoke rooms in the three kingdoms, and had been talked about everywhere as the handsome Miss Baldwin. Yet her 27th birthday had sounded, and she was Miss Baldwin still. Half a dozen times she had fancied herself upon the eve of a great success, such a marriage as would at once exalt her to the pinnacle of social distinction, and at the last moment, as it seemed, the man had changed his mind. Some malicious mother of ugly daughters, or disappointed spinster, had told the eligible suitor things about Miss Baldwin, harmless little deviations from the rigid lines of maidenly etiquette, and the suitor had cried off, fearing in his own succinct speech that he was going to be had. At 27, damaged by the reputation of failure, spoken of by the initiated as "that handsome girl Maltravers so nearly married, don't you know?" Miss Baldwin felt that all hope of a great match was over. The funeral bell of ambition had tolled. She began to grow reckless, eat her dinner and took her dry champagne with a masculine gusto, smoked as many cigarettes as a Secretary of Legation, read all the new French novels, and talked about them unreservedly with her partners, was keen upon racing, and loved euchre and nap. She had half made up her mind to throw herself away upon the first wealthy cotton spinner she might meet up in the North, when she allowed herself to be touched by Harrington Dalbrook's somewhat boyish devotion, and began to wonder whether it might not be well for her to end her checkered career by a love match. He was good looking, much better educated than her brother and her brother's set, and he adored her. But on the other hand he was utterly without any claims to be considered "smart," and marriage with him would mean at best bread and cheese, or would at least mean nothing better than bread and cheese until they should both be middle aged, and she should have lost all semblance of a waist. She had met solicitors' wives in society who wore diamonds, and who hurried away from evening parties because they were afraid of their horses catching cold, a carefulness which to her mind implied that horses were a novelty. She had even heard of solicitors making big fortunes; but she concluded that those were exceptional men, and she did not see in Harrington's character the potentiality of wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. Moved by these mixed feelings, she allowed her lover to dangle in a state of uncertainty, and to spend all his spare cash upon those airy nothings which a young lady of Miss Baldwin's easy temper will accept from even a casual admirer. He knew the glover whose gloves she approved, and she occasionally told him the colour of a gown in advance, so that he might give her a suitable fan; and she had, furthermore, an off-hand way of mentioning any songs or new French novels she fancied. "How very sweet of you," she would say when the songs of the books appeared, "but it is really too bad. I must never mention anything I want in your hearing." In spite of which wise remark the volatile damsel went on mentioning things, and being surprised when her wishes were gratified. Miss Baldwin had met Lady Cheriton and her daughter both in town and country, and she and her people had been invited to garden parties at Cheriton Chase, but there had been no intimacy between the families. Lady Cheriton shrank with an inward terror from a young lady of such advanced opinions as those which drop like pearls and diamonds, or like toads and adders, according to the idea of her hearers, from Miss Baldwin's lips. Rumours of the young man's infatuation had been conveyed to the Priory by Lady Jane, and Harrington, having gone to a family dinner at Millbrook, was severely interrogated by his cousin. "I hope there is no truth in what I have heard about you, Harry," she said confidentially, when he was sitting by her in her favourite corner within the shadow of the tall screen. "I cannot answer that question until you tell me what you have heard," he replied with offended dignity. "Something that would make me very unhappy if it were true. I was told you were getting entangled with that Miss Baldwin." I don't know why you should lay such an offensive emphasis upon the demonstrative pronoun. Miss Baldwin is beautiful and accomplished, and — I am very proud of being attached to her." " Has it gone so far as that, Harry ? Are you actually engaged to her ?"" I am not actually engaged — she has a right to look a good deal higher — but I hope to make her my wife as soon as I am in a position to marry. She has given me so much encouragement that I don't think she will refuse me when the right time comes." " But, my dear boy, she is always giving encouragement," exclaimed Juanita anxiously. Dear little Lucy Grenville was at the piano at the other end of the room playing an infantile arrangement of Batti Batti, with fingers of iron, while mother and grandmother hung over her enraptured, and while the rest of the family party talked their loudest, so the cousins in the nook by the fire were not afraid of being overheard. " She is the most encouraging young lady I ever heard of. She has jilted and been jilted a dozen times, I believe." " You believe !" echoed Harrington, with intense indignation. " I wonder that a girl of your good sense in most things can give heed to such idle gossip." " Do you mean to say that she has not been jilted ?"" Certainly not. I admit that her name has been associated with names of men in society. Silly people who write for the papers have given out things about her. She was to marry Lord Welbeck — Sir Humphrey Random — heaven knows whom. A girl can't stay at big houses, and be admired as she has been, without all manner of reports getting about. But she is heartily sick of that kind of life, an endless web of unmeaning gaieties — that is what she herself called it. She will be very glad to settle down to a refined, quiet life — say at the West End of London, with a victoria and a brougham, and a small house prettily furnished. One can furnish so prettily and so cheaply nowadays," concluded Harrington, with his mind's eye upon certain illustrated advertisements he had seen of late — Jacobean dining rooms, Sheraton drawing rooms — for a mere song. " I have heard people say that a reformed rake makes a good husband," said Juanita gravely, " but I have never heard that a reformed flirt makes a good wife." " It is a shame to talk like that, Juanita. Every handsome girl is more or less a flirt. She can't help flirting. Men insist upon flirting with her." " Does your father know you mean to marry Miss Baldwin ?"" No, I have never mentioned marriage to him. That will come in good time." " And do you think he will approve ?"" I don't know. He is full of old fashioned prejudices, but I don't see how he can object to my marrying into one of the county families." " Don't you think it will be more like Miss Baldwin marrying out of one of the county families ? I'm afraid, from what I know of her brother and of old Lady Baldwin, they would both want her to marry money." " I suppose they have wanted that for the last 4 or 5 years," answered Harrington ;" but it has not come off, and they must be satisfied if she chooses to marry for love." " Well, I mustn't plague you any more, Harry. I see your heart is too deeply involved. I hope Miss Baldwin is a nicer girl than I have ever thought her. Girls are sometimes prejudiced against each other." " Occasionally," said Harrington, with satirical emphasis. Lucy finished Batti Batti with a final chord in the bass, and a final twirl in the treble, and was pronounced by her grandmother to have achieved wonders. " Her time is a little uncertain," her mother remarked modestly, " but she has a magnificent ear. You should see her run to the window when there is an organ in the street." " Yes, mother," cried Johnny, " but she never stays to listen, unless there is a monkey on the top." December came, and the Hunt Ball, at which more than one of Miss Baldwin's discarded or discarding admirers were present. The young lady looked very handsome in white satin and gauze, without a vestige of colour about her costume, and with her bodice cut with an audacity which is the peculiar privilege of dressmakers who live south of Oxford Street. The white gown set off Miss Baldwin's brilliant colouring, and looked well against the pink coats of her partners. Harrington's dress suit had been a thing of beauty and a joy to him when it came home from his London tailor's, folded as no human hands could ever fold it again, enshrined in layers of tissue paper. His sisters had helped to unpack the tailor's parcel, and had exclaimed at the extravagance of the corded silk lapels and the satin sleeve lining, and he had himself deemed that the archetypal coat could scarcely be more beautiful. Yet in this lurid ball room he felt ashamed of his modest black twilled kerseymere, and the insignificance of his white tie. The fox hunters seemed to him to have it all their own way. Miss Baldwin, however, was not unkind. She danced with him oftener than with any one else, especially after supper,
When she became unconscientious and forgetful as to her engagements, and when her card was found to hold twice as many names as there were dances, together with a pencil sketch of a lobster waltzing with a champagne bottle supplied by an unknown hand. It was a cold, clear night, and youth and imprudence were going in couples to the garden behind the ballroom for coolness between the dances, and to look at the frosty stars, which in the enthusiasm of girlhood were accepted as a novelty. Harrington and Juliet were among those who ventured into the garden, the lady wrapped in a great white fur cloak, which made her look like a haystack in a snow piece. "Poor Doriscourt brought me this polar bear skin," she said. "He shot the bear himself, at the risk of his life. I had asked him to bring me a skin when he came home." "You asked him to give you something for which he must risk his life, and yet you make a great fuss at accepting Daudet's last novel from me," said Harrington, with tender reproachfulness. "Ah, but you and Doriscourt are so different," exclaimed Juliet, rather contemptuously. "He was a great dare devil, who would have come down hand over hand on a rope from the moon if there had been any way of getting up there." "What has become of him?" "Dead. He died a year ago — of drink, I'm afraid — lung complaint, complicated with del. Trem. Poor fellow." She breathed a deep sigh, with that little pensive air which in a young lady of experience is as much as to say, "He is the only man I ever loved," and then she turned the conversation and talked of the supper and the champagne, which she sweepingly condemned. Harrington hated that talk about the supper. He would have preferred talking of the stars like a schoolgirl, or Claude Melnotte, wondering what star should be our home when love becomes immortal. To be told that the wine which now glowed in his veins and intensified his passion was not worth 3 and 6 a bottle jarred upon his finer feelings. "You are such a cynic," he said. "I think I shall never get any nearer to your real self; for I know there is a heart under that mocking vein." And then he repeated his simple story of a humble, devoted love — humble because the woman he loved was the loveliest among all womankind, and because she occupied a higher plane than that on which his youth had been spent. "But you have taught me what ambition means," he said. "Only promise to be my wife, and you shall see that I am in earnest — that it is in me to succeed." She had long been wavering, touched by his truthfulness, his boyish devotion, very weary of life at the Mount, where the mother scolded and the sister sneered, where the underfed and underpaid servants were frankly disobliging, where her brother rarely saw his womankind except at meals, which periods of family life he enlivened by a good deal of strong language, grumbling at the cookery, and at the deterioration of landed property in general and his own in particular. The rest of his home life he spent in the billiard room or the stables, since he found the society of the saddle room more congenial than the dreariness of the drawing room, where his mother and sisters were not always on speaking terms. From such a house as the Mount — goodly and fair to look upon without as many other whited sepulchres — any escape would be welcome. Juliet felt that she was a great deal too good for a young man of uncertain prospects and humdrum surroundings; but he was very much in love, and he was good looking, and in her own particular phraseology she was beginning to be rather weak about him. She was so weak that she let him hold her unresisting hand as they stood side by side in the garden, and devour it with kisses. "You certainly ought to do well in the world," she said sweetly, "for you are the most persistent person I ever knew." He looked round, saw that they were alone in the garden, and clasped her in his arms, polar bear and all, and kissed the unresisting lips as he had kissed the unresisting hand. "My dearest," he exclaimed, "that means for life, does it not?" "You are taking everything for granted," she said, "but I suppose it must be so. Only remember, I don't want our engagement talked about till you are in a more assured position. My mother would make home a hell upon earth if she knew." "I will do nothing rash, nothing that you do not approve," replied Harrington, considerably relieved by this injunction; for although it was not Matthew Dalbrook's habit to make a pandemonium of the family circle, Harrington feared that he would strongly disapprove of such an alliance as that which his younger son had chosen for himself. He welcomed the idea of delay, hoping to be more firmly seated at the office desk before he must needs make the unpleasing avowal. "When my father finds I am valuable to him he will be more inclined to indulgence," he thought. CHAPter XV. Volume 1, Chapter 15 of The Day Will Come by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. For men have marble, women waxen minds, and therefore are they formed as marble will. The weak oppressed, the impression of strange kinds, is formed in them by force, by fraud, or skill. Then call them not the authors of their ill. Inclination would have taken Theodore Dalbrook to Dorsetshire before the Christmas holidays gave him an excuse for going home, but he wrestled with that haunting desire to revisit the Priory, and to begin again tete-a-tete with his cousin in the dimly lighted room where she had talked to him of her own sorrows and of his ambitions. The memory of that last evening was the most vivid element in his life. It stood out like a spot of light against the dull grey of monotonous days, and the burden of dry as dust reading. But he had told her that he should not see her until Christmas time, and he was not weak enough to indulge that insane longing for the society of a woman whose heart was in the grave of her husband. November and the greater part of December stretched before him, like a long dark road which had to be trodden somehow before he came to the inn at which there would be light and comfort, cheerful voices and friendly greetings. He set his face resolutely towards that dark prospect, and tramped along, doing the work he had to do, living the life of a hermit in those chambers in Ferret Court, which had already taken the stamp of his own character, and looked as if he had lived in them for years. He had no need to sit alone at night with his books and his lamp, for there were plenty of houses in which he would have been welcome. His name was a passport in legal circles. Old friends of James Dalbrook's were ready to welcome his kinsman to their tables, eager to be of service to him. He had his college friends, too, in the great city, and need not have been companionless. But he was not in the mood for society of any kind, old or young, except the society of Blackstone, Coke, and Justinian, and divers other sages who out of the dim past shed their light upon the legal wilderness of the present. He sat by his fire and read law, and laid down his book only to smoke his meditative pipe, and indulge in foolish waking dreams about that grave old house in Dorsetshire and the young widow who lived there. He had followed two of those three children of the old squire, two out of the three faces in the picture in the hall at Cheriton, to the end of their story. No man could discover any postscript to that story, which in each case was closed by a grave. There remained only one last unfinished record, the history of the runaway wife, the end whereof was open to doubt. That unlucky lady's fate had been accepted upon hearsay. It had been said that she had died at Boulogne within a year or so after the vicar met her there. Upon his return from Jersey, Theodore wrote to his father's oldest and most experienced clerk, begging him to hunt up the evidence of Mrs. Darcy's death, so far as it was obtainable at Cheriton or in the neighbourhood. The clerk replied as follows after an interval of 10 days. Dear Sir, I have been twice to Cheriton, and have made inquiries, cautiously as you wished, with respect to the report of Mrs. Darcy's death some 15 years ago, and saw Mr. Dolby, the doctor, and Gaster at the general shop, who, as you are no doubt aware, is a gentleman who busies himself a good deal about other people's affairs, and sets himself up for being an authority upon most things. Mr. Dolby I found very vague in his ideas. He remembered the late vicar telling him about having met Mrs. Darcy in the market-place at Boulogne, and being shocked at the change in her. He told Mr. Dolby that he did not think she was long for this world; but it was some time after when Dolby heard someone, he could not remember who it was, assert that Mrs. Darcy was dead. Gaster had much more to say upon the subject. He pretends to be interested in all reminiscences of the Strangways, and boasts of having served Cheriton House for nearly 40 years. He remembers Evelyn Strangway when she was a little girl, handsome and high-spirited. He remembered the report of her death at Boulogne getting about the village, and he remembered mentioning the fact to Lord Cheriton at the time. There was an election going on just then, and his lordship had looked in to consult him, Joseph Gaster, about certain business details. And his lordship seemed shocked to hear of the poor lady's death. "I suppose that is the end of the family, my lord," Gaster said, and his lordship replied, "Yes, that is the end of the Strangways." Gaster believes that he must have read of the death in the newspapers, perhaps copied from the Times into a local paper; at any rate, the fact had implanted itself in his mind, and it never occurred to him to doubt it. I asked him if he knew what had become of the lady's husband, but here his mind is a blank. He had heard that the man was a scamp, and that was all he knew about him. Since making these inquiries I have spent a long evening at the Literary Institute, where, as you know, there is a set of the Times in volumes extending over a period of 40 years. I have looked through the desks for 3 years, taking the year in which Gaster thinks he heard of Mrs. Darcy's death as the middle year out of 3, but without result. It is, of course, unlikely that the death would be advertised if the poor lady died friendless and in poverty in a foreign town, but I thought it my duty to make this investigation. Awaiting your further commands, etc., etc." There was nothing conclusive in this, and Theodore felt that the history of Mrs. Darcy's later years remained to be unravelled. It was not to be supposed that the runaway wife, who, if she were yet living, must be an elderly woman, could have had an act or part in the murder of Sir Godfrey Carmichael, but it was not the less a part of his task to trace her story to its final chapter. Then only could he convince Juanita of the wildness of that idea which connected the catastrophe of the 29th of July with the exiled Strangways. When he could say to her, "You see that long before that fatal night the Squire's 3 children had vanished from this earth," she would be constrained to confess that the solution of the mystery was not to be sought here. He went over to Boulogne, saw the English chaplain and several of the hotel keepers. He explored the cemetery and examined the record of the dead. He visited the police, and he made friends with the elderly editor of an old established newspaper, but from all his questioning of various people the result was blank. Nobody remembered a Mrs. Darcy, an Englishwoman of distinguished appearance but fallen fortunes, a woman long past youth and yet not old. If she had lived for any time in Boulogne she had left no trace of her existence; if she had died and been buried there she had left no record among the graves. Boulogne could tell him nothing. He came back to the great wilderness of London, the rallying point for all wanderers. It was there, perhaps, that the end of Evelyn Strangway was to be sought. He had, as it seemed to him, only one clue, the name of her governess. The governess was only 7 or 8 years older than the pupil, and she might have survived her pupil, and might have been in communication with her till the end. Jasper Blake had told him that there was a strong attachment between Sarah Newton and the wayward girl she taught. To hunt for a governess among the thousands of portionless gentlewomen who try to live by teaching might seem more hopeless than the proverbial search for the lost needle, but Theodore did not despair. If Miss Newton had remained a spinster and had continued to exercise her vocation as a teacher she might be traced through one of those agencies which transact business between governess and employer; but on the other hand, if, as was more likely, she had long ago abandoned the profession of teacher, and had made some obscure marriage, she would have sunk into the vast ocean of middle class life, in whose depths it would be almost impossible to discover her. The first thing to be done was to make a visitation of the agencies, and this task Theodore began 2 days after his return from Boulogne. He had methodized his life by this time, devoting a certain portion of his days to his cousin's interests, but in no wise neglecting the work he had to do for his own advancement. He had known too many instances of men who had made reading law an excuse for an idle and desultory life, and he was resolved that his own course should be steady and persistent even to doggedness. He had been told that success at the bar was nowadays almost unattainable, that the men of the day who had conquered fame and were making great fortunes were in a manner miraculous men, and that it was futile for any young man to hope to follow in their steps. The road they had trodden was barred against the newcomer. Theodore listened to these pessimists, yet was not discouraged. He had told himself that he would emerge somehow from the obscurity of a country solicitor's practice, would bring himself in some wise nearer the social level of the woman he loved, so that if in the days to come one gleam of hope should ever shine upon that love he might be able to say to her, "My place in life is the place your father held when he offered himself to your mother. My determination to conquer fortune is not less than his." He seldom passed the dingy door of the ground floor chambers, on which the several names of 3 briefless ones were painted in dirty letters that had once been white, without thinking of his fortunate kinsman, without wondering what his life had been like in those darksome rooms, and in what shape fortune had first appeared to him. He had not married until he was 40. Long and lonely years had gone before that golden summertide of his life, when a young and lovely woman had given him happiness and fortune. How had he lived in those lonely years? Tradition accused him of miserly habits, of shabby raiment, of patient grinding and scraping to accumulate wealth. Theodore knew that if he had hoarded his earnings it had been for a worthy end. He had set himself to win a place among the lords of the soil. The land he loved had been to him as a mistress, and for that he had been content to live poorly and spend his nights in toil. For such miserliness Theodore had nothing but admiration, for he had seen how liberally the man who had scraped and hoarded was able to administer a large income, How generous as a master, friend, and patron the sometime miser had shown himself. He spent more than a week in visiting the numerous agencies which are employed by the great governess class, and the result of that painstaking exploration was not altogether barren. He succeeded in finding an elderly personage at the head of an old established agency, who kept her books with praiseworthy regularity, and who remembered Sarah Newton. She had had no less than 4 Miss Newtons on her register at different times, but there was only one Sarah Newton among them, and for this lady she had obtained a situation in the Lake country so lately as July 20th, 1873, that is to say, about 11 years before the period of Theodore's investigation. On that date Miss Newton had entered the family of a Mr. Craven, the vicar of a small parish between Ambleside and Bowness. She was living in that family 4 years afterwards, when Miss Palmer, the principal in the agency, last heard of her. "And in all probability she is living there still," said Miss Palmer. "At her time of life people are not fond of change. I remember her when she was a young woman, full of energy and very impatient of control. I used to see her much oftener then. She seldom kept a situation over a 12-month." "Except at Cheriton Chase. She was more than a year in that situation, I think." "Cheriton Chase. I don't remember the name. Some one else may have got her the situation. How long ago was she there, do you suppose?" asked Miss Palmer, turning over one of her neat basil bound registers. "It was in the year '47 she left Cheriton." "Ah, then, it was not we who got her the situation. My first entry about her is on the 11th December, '48. She paid her entrance fee of 1 guinea on that date. It is higher than that of inferior agencies; but we take real trouble for our clients, and we make it our business to be safe upon the point of character. We are as careful about the families into which we send governesses as about the governesses we introduce to families." The next day was Sunday, and Theodore employed that day of rest in travelling by a very slow train to Bowness, where he arrived at 5 o'clock in the evening to find mountain and lake hidden in the densest gray, and an innkeeper who seemed neither to desire nor deserve visitors. Happily the traveller was of the age at which dinner is not a vital question, and he was hardly aware of the toughness of the steak, or the inferior quality of the codfish set before him in the desolate coffee room. He had a diamond Virgil in his pocket, and he sat by the fire reading the 6th book by the paraffin lamp till 10 o'clock, and then went contentedly to a bedroom which suggested ghosts, or at least nightmare. No deadly visions troubled him, however, for the slow train had brought about a condition of abject weariness which resulted in dreamless slumber. The sun shone into his bleak bedchamber when he awoke next morning, and the lake stretched beneath his windows, silver shining, melting dimly into the gray of the opposite shore. The rugged mountains were sulking still, and only showed their rugged crests above dark rolling clouds; but the scene was an improvement upon the avenue of chimney pots and distant glimpse of a murky Thames as seen from the Ferret Court. His landlord greeted him in a more cheerful spirit upon Monday morning than he had evinced on Sunday evening, when his after dinner lethargy was rudely disturbed by a guest whose businesslike air and small Gladstone bag did not promise much profit; a visitor who would want a dinner off the joint most likely, and a half-crown breakfast; a visitor whose libations would be limited to bitter beer and an occasional whiskey and soda. Such a guest in a house that was beginning to hibernate was a burden rather than a boon. This morning, however, the landlord was reconciled to his solitary customer, having told his wife that, after all, little fish are sweet, and he went blithely to order the dog cart, his own cart and own man, ostler in the season, coachman or anything you please out of the season, to drive Mr. Dalbrook to Kettisford Vicarage, a 9-mile journey. It was a pretty out-of-the-way nook, half hidden in a cleft of the hills, at which Theodore arrived a few minutes after noon; a little, old-fashioned, world-forgotten village, and a sprawling old gray stone house, covered with Virginia creeper, passion flower, and the feathery leafage of the trumpet ash, a long, low house, with heavily thatched roof, projecting over its upper casements. A sleepy-looking old house, in a still sleepier garden, so remote and so sheltered that winter had forgotten to come there; and the great yellow roses were still blooming on the wall, fattened by the misty atmosphere of the adjacent lake, glorified by the untainted air. November was half over, yet here the only signs of autumn were the gray sky and the crimson of the Virginia creeper. The Vicar of Kettisford was one of those privileged persons who can speak with their enemies at the gate, assured of being backed up in their speech by a family contingent.
The vicarage seemed overflowing with young life, from the very threshold of the hall, where cricket bats, a tricycle, a row of well-used tennis rackets, a stupendous array of hats, overcoats, and comforters testified to that quiverful so esteemed in the patriarchal age. A conscientious performer was pounding at the "harmonious blacksmith" upon a wiry piano near at hand, having left the door wide open, with the indecent disregard of other people peculiar to juvenile performers upon all kinds of instruments. From the other side of the hall came the twanging of an equally wiry guitar, upon which girlish fingers began and for ever recommenced a Spanish melody, which the performer was striving to attain by that agonizing process known among young ladies as "picking up" an air. Mark, gentle reader, what the learned and Reverend Haweis has to say upon this art of playing by ear. From a remoter room came young voices and young laughter, and amidst all these sounds it was hardly surprising that Mr. Dalbrook had to ring 3 times, and to wait in front of the open hall door for at least 10 minutes, before an elderly housemaid responded to his summons and ushered him into the vicar's study, the one room in the vicarage which was ever fit to receive a visitor. The vicar was reading a newspaper in front of a comfortable fire. He was an elderly man, of genial and even jovial aspect, and he received Mr. Dalbrook's apologetic account of himself and his business with perfect good humour. "Ah, you want to see Miss Newton, my dear sir. I am sorry to tell you she left us nearly 2 years ago. Heartily sorry, for Sarah Newton is a very worthy woman, and a jewel of price in a motherless family like mine," said the vicar. "I regret that you should have come such a long way to find her when, had you written to me, I could have told you where to look for her in London." "Yes, it was a mistake to come so far without making preliminary inquiries. Only, as she had not applied to her usual agent for a new situation, I concluded that she was still under your roof." "She has not gone into a new situation, Mr. Dalbrook. She was too much valued in this house to wish to change to another employment, although she might have lived more luxuriously and done less work elsewhere. She was a mother to my girls, ay, and to my boys as well, while she was with us; and she only left us when she made up her mind to live an independent life." "She has left off teaching, then, I conclude?" "Yes. She had a little bit of money left her by a bachelor uncle, safely invested in railway stock, and yielding about 200 a year. This, with her own savings, made her an independent woman, and she made up her mind to realize her own ideal of a useful life, an ideal which had been developing in her mind for a good many years, a life which was to be serviceable to others and yet pleasant to herself." "Do you mean that she joined some sisterhood?" "No, no, Mr. Dalbrook. Sarah Newton is much too fond of her own way, much too independent and fiery a spirit, to place herself in a position where other people would think for her, and where she would be obliged to obey. She told me her plan of life very frankly. 'I have about £260 a year,' she said. 'I can live comfortably upon half that money, if I live after a plan of my own, and I can do a great deal of good with the other half if I do it in my own way. I am elderly and plain. If I were to live amongst small gentilities I should be a nobody, and in all probability I should be considered a bore. I shall take a lodging in a poor neighborhood, furnish my rooms with the utmost comfort, treat myself to a good piano, and collect my little library, book by book, from the second-hand booksellers. I shall spend half my days in going quietly about the poor young women of the district. I ought to know what girls are after nearly 40 years teaching and managing the species, and I shall spend half my income in doing as much good to them as I can, in my own unorthodox way. I knew the good that brave little soul had done in this parish, in her quiet, unpretentious fashion, and I felt no doubt she would carry out her plan." "Have you seen her since she left you?" "Yes. I went to see her last June when I had a fortnight's holiday in London. I found her in a shabby old house in Lambeth, not very far from St. Thomas's Hospital, but dingy as the house looked outside, our good Sally's apartments were the picture of comfort. I found her as happy as a bird. Her plan of life had answered her highest expectations. 'My friends are legion,' she said, 'but I haven't a single gentility among them. Sally is a desperate radical, you must know.'" "Will you give me her address, that I may write and ask permission to call upon her?" "You shall have the address, but I doubt if she will feel disposed to receive you. She will count you among the gentilities." I must try my chance at any rate. I want her to throw some light upon the history of one of her earliest pupils. Did you ever hear her talk of Cheriton Chase and the Strangway family?" "My dear sir, I have heard her talk of any number of places and any number of people. I used to tell her she must be a female Methuselah to have passed through so many experiences. She was very fond of telling stories of the families in which she had lived, but though I used to listen, I remember very little about them. My girls would remember better, I have no doubt. They can give you chapter and verse, I daresay. So the best thing you can do is to eat your luncheon with us, and then you can ask them as many questions as you like."
Theodore accepted the offer with gratitude, and 10 minutes afterwards followed the Vicar into the dining room, where 3 tall, good-looking girls and 2 straggling youths were assembled, and where a 4th girl and another boy dropped in after the rest were seated. The board was spread with a plenteous but homely meal. A large dish of Irish stew smoked at one end of the table, and the remains of yesterday's roast ribs of beef appeared at the other. The girls were evidently accustomed to droppers in, and received Theodore with perfect equanimity. Alicia, the eldest, carved the beef with a commanding wrist, and the 3rd daughter, Laura, administered to his appetite with pickled walnuts and mashed potatoes. The girls were all keenly interested directly he spoke of Miss Newton. They pronounced her a dear old thing, not a bit like a governess. "We all loved her," said Alicia, "and we are not the easiest girls to get on with, I can assure you. We have had 2 poor things since Sally deserted us, and we have driven them both away. And now we are enjoying an interregnum, and we hope that dear father will make it a long one."
"Did you ever hear your governess talk of the Strangways, Miss Craven?"
"What, Evelyn Strangway of Cheriton Chase? I should think we did indeed," cried Laura. "She had a good many prosy stories, chestnuts, we used to call them, but the Cheriton Chase stories were the most chestnutty. It was her first situation, and she was never tired of talking about it."
"Do you know if she kept up her acquaintance with Miss Strangway in after life?" asked Theodore.
"I think not. At any rate, she never talked about that. She knew something about the poor girl's later life, something very bad, I think, for she never would tell us. She used to sigh and look very unhappy if the subject was touched upon, and she used to warn us against runaway matches. As if any of us would be likely to run away from this dear old father," protested Laura, leaning over the table to pat the Vicar's coat sleeve. "Why, he would let us marry chimney sweeps rather than see us unhappy."
There was a good deal more talk about Sarah Newton, her virtues and her little peculiarities, but nothing bearing upon Theodore's business, so he only stayed till luncheon was finished, and then wished the amiable Vicar and his family a friendly good bye, offering to be of use to them in London at any time they might want some small business transacted there, and begging the Vicar to look him up at his chambers when he took his next holiday.
"You may rely upon it I shall take you at your word," said the parson cheerily. "You've no idea what a gay old dog I am when I am in town. The theatre every night, and a little bit of supper afterwards. I generally take one of my lads with me, though, to keep me out of mischief. Good-bye, and mind you don't fall in love with Sally Newton. She's old and ugly, but she's one of the most fascinating women I know."
Theodore drove off in the dog cart with all the Vicarage family at the gate waving their hands to him, as if he had been an old friend, and with 4 Vicarage dogs barking at him. He went back to London that night, and wrote to Miss Newton, asking leave to call upon her upon a matter relating to one of her old pupils on the following day. He should take silence to mean consent, and would be with her at 4 in the afternoon if he did not receive a telegram to forbid him. He worked in his chambers all the morning, and at a little after 3 set out to walk to Lambeth. The address was 51 Wedgwood Street, near the Lambeth Road. It was not a long walk, and it was not a pleasant one, for a seasonable fog was gathering when Theodore left the Temple, and it thickened as he crossed Westminster Bridge, where the newly lighted lamps made faint yellow patches in the dense brown atmosphere. Under these conditions it took him some time to find Wedgwood Street, and that particular house which had the honour of sheltering Sarah Newton. It was a very shabby old street. The shops were of the meanest order, and the houses, which were not shops, looked as if they were mostly let off to the struggling class of lodgers, but it was a street that had evidently seen better days, for the houses were large and substantially built, and the doorways had once been handsome and architectural — houses which had been the homes of prosperous citizens when Lambeth was out of town, and when the perfume of bean blossom and new mown hay found its way into Wedgwood Street.
The ground floor of number 51 was occupied by a shoemaker who had turned his parlour into a shop, who made to measure, but was not above executing repairs neatly. The front door being open, Theodore walked straight upstairs to the first landing, where there was a neat little Doulton ware oil lamp burning on a carved oak bracket, and where he saw Miss Newton's name painted in bold black letters upon a terra cotta coloured door. The stairs were cleaner than they generally are in such a house, and the landing was spotless. He rang a bell, and the door was promptly opened by a lady whom he took to be Miss Newton. She was rather below middle height, strongly built, but of a neat, compact figure. She was decidedly plain, and her iron grey hair was coarse and wiry, but she had large bright eyes which beamed with good nature and intelligence. Her black stuff gown and narrow linen collar, the knot of scarlet ribbon at her throat, and the linen cuffs turned back over perfectly fitting sleeves, were all the pink of neatness, and suited her as no other kind of dress would have done. The trim figure, the bright eyes, and the small white hands made a favourable impression upon Theodore, in spite of the lady's homeliness of feature and complexion. "Walk in, Mr. Dalbrook," she said, cheerily. "Pray come and sit by the fire. You must be chilled to the bone after coming through that horrid fog. Ah, how I hate fog! It is the scourge of the London poor, and it sometimes kills even the rich. And now we are only at the beginning of the evil, and there is the long winter before us." "Yes, it is very bad, no doubt. But you do not look as if the fog would do you much harm, Miss Newton." "No, it won't hurt me. I'm a hardy old plant, and I contrive to make myself comfortable at all seasons." "You do, indeed," he answered, glancing around the room. "I had no idea." "That anybody could be so comfortable in Lambeth," she said, interpreting his thoughts. "No, people think they must pay for what they call a good situation. Poor pinched widows and shabby spinsters spend more than half their income on rent and taxes, and starve on the other half, in order to live in a genteel locality — some dingy little street in Pimlico, perhaps, or a stucco terrace in Kensington. Here am I, with 2 fine large rooms in a forgotten old street, which was built before the age of shoddy. I live among poor people, and am not obliged to sacrifice a sixpence for the sake of appearances. I buy everything in the cheapest market, and my neighbours look up to me, instead of looking down upon me, as they might if I lived among gentilities. You will say, perhaps, that I live in the midst of dirt and squalor. If I do, I take care that none of it ever comes near me, and I do all that one woman's voice and one woman's pen can do to lessen the evils that I see about me." "It would be a good thing for poor neighbourhoods if there were many ladies of your mind, Miss Newton," said Theodore, basking in the glow of the fire, and looking lazily round the room, with its 2 well-filled bookcases, occupying the recesses on each side of the fireplace, its brackets and shelves, and hanging pockets, its large old-fashioned sofa, and substantial claw-footed table, its wicker chairs, cushioned with bright colour, its lamps and candlesticks on shelf and bracket, ready to the hand when extra light should be wanted, its contrivances and handinesses of all kinds, which denoted the womanly inventiveness of the tenant. "Well, I believe it would. If only a small percentage of the lonely spinsters of England would make their abode among the poor, things would have to be mended somehow." "There could not be such crying evils as there are if there were more eyes to see them, and more voices to protest against them. You like this old room of mine, I see, Mr. Dalbrook," added Sarah Newton, following his eyes as they surveyed the dark red wall against which the brackets and shelves, and books and photographs, and bits of old china stood out in bright relief. "I am full of admiration and surprise." "It is all my own work. I had lived in other people's houses so long that I was charmed to have a home of my own, even in Lambeth. I was determined to spend very little money and yet to make myself comfortable. So I just squatted in the next room for the first 3 months, with only a bedstead, a table, and a chair or 2, while I prowled all over London to find the exact furniture I wanted. There's not an article in the room that did not take me weeks to find and to buy, and there's not an article that wasn't a tremendous bargain. But what an egotistical old prattler I am! Women who live much alone get to be dreadful prosers. I won't say another word about myself. At any rate, not till after I've made you a cup of tea after your cold walk." She had seen the mud upon his boots, and guessed that he had walked from the Temple. "Pray do not take any trouble." "Nonsense. It is never trouble to a woman to make tea. I give a tea party twice a week. I hope you like tea."
I adore it. But pray go on with your account of how you settled down here. I am warmly interested." "That's very good of you, but there's not much to tell about myself," said Miss Newton, producing some pretty old china out of an antique cupboard with glass doors, and setting out a little brass tea tray while she talked. There was a small copper kettle singing on the old fashioned hob, and there was a covered dish of toast in the capacious fender. Miss Newton's dinners were ever of the slightest, but she was a sybarite as to her tea and toast. No cheap and powdery mixture, no inferior Dosset for her. She made her brew with a dainty precision which Theodore admired, while she went on talking. "Do you like the colour of the walls?" "Yes, I painted them." "And you like that paper on the ceiling?" "I papered it." "I am rather a dab at carpentering, too, and I put up all those shelves and brackets, and I covered the chairs, and stained the boards round that old Turkey carpet, and then, after a day's hard work, it was very pleasant to go and stroll about among the bookshops of an evening, and pick up a volume here and there till I got all my old friends about me. I felt like a Leah, only I had no Bridget to share my pleasure." She seated herself opposite to him, with a wicker table in front of her, and began to pour out the tea. He wondered to find himself as much at home with her as if he had known her all his life. "It is very good of you to receive me so cordially," he said presently. "I feel that I come to you as an unauthorized intruder." "Can you guess why I was willing to receive you?" she asked, looking at him intently and with a sudden gravity. "Can you guess why I didn't telegraph to forbid your coming?" "Indeed, no, except because you are naturally kind." "My kindness had nothing to do with it. I was willing to see you because of your name. It is a very familiar name to me. Dalbrook, the name of the man who bought the house in which she was born. Poor soul, how she must have hated him in her desolate after years. How she must have hated the race that ousted her from the home she loved." "You are talking of Evelyn Strangway?" "Yes, she was my first pupil, and I was very fond of her, all the fonder of her, perhaps, because she was wayward and difficult to manage, and because I was much too young and inexperienced to exercise any authority over her." "It is of her I want to talk to you, if you will allow me." "Certainly. I like talking of those old days when I was a girl. I don't suppose I was particularly happy at Cheriton Chase; but I was young, and we most of us hugged the delusion that we were happy in our youth. Poor Evelyn! So often in disgrace, so often unhappy, from the very dawn of girlhood. What reason can you have for being curious about her?" "I have a very strong reason, though I cannot explain it yet awhile. I have set myself to discover the history of that banished race." "After the angel with the flaming sword stood at the gate, that is to say, after Mr. Dalbrook bought the property. By the by, what are you to Lord Cheriton? His son, perhaps?" "No, I am only a distant cousin." "Is it on his account you are making these inquiries?" "He is not even aware that I am making them." "Indeed! And pray how did you find me out? My tea parties are not recorded in the society papers. I have never figured among celebrities at home." "I took some pains to find you," said Theodore, and then he told her of his visits to the agencies, and his journey to the vicarage in Lakeland. "You have taken infinite trouble, and for a small result. I can give you very little information about Evelyn Strangway, afterwards Mrs. Darcy." "Did you lose sight of her after you left Cheriton?" "Yes, for a long time. It was years before we met again. But she wrote to me several times from Lausanne during the first year of her banishment — doleful letters, complaining bitterly of her father's cruelty in keeping her away from her beloved Cheriton, the horses and dogs, the life she loved. School she detested. She was clever, but she had no taste for intellectual pursuits. She soon wearied of the lake and the mountains and the humdrum society of a small town. She wrote of herself as a galley slave. Then came a sudden change, and she began to write about him. You don't know the way a girl writes about him. The first him she has ever thought worthy to be written about. Her tone was light enough at the beginning. She had met a young Irishman at a little evening party, and they had laughed together at Lausanne society. He was an officer, on furlough, full of wit and fun. I need not go into details. I saw her danger, and warned her.
I reminded her that her father would never allow her to marry a subaltern in a marching regiment, and that such a marriage would mean starvation. Her father would give her nothing. It was incumbent on her to marry well, and with her attractions she had only to wait for a good offer. It would inevitably come in due time."
"She was handsome, I suppose? I know her face in the picture at Cheriton. My cousin bought all the old portraits."
"She was much handsomer than the picture. That was painted when she was only 15, but at 17 her beauty had developed, and she was one of the most brilliant blondes I ever saw. Well, I suppose you know how useless my advice was. She ran away with her Irish admirer, and I heard no more of her for nearly 4 years, when I met her one afternoon in the Strand, and she took me home to her lodging in Cecil Street, and gave me some tea. It was in October, and I stayed with her till dark, and then she insisted on seeing me off in the omnibus to Haverstock Hill, where I was then living in an artist's family. The lodgings were shabby, and she was shabbily dressed. She was as handsome as ever, but she looked worried and unhappy. Her husband had sold out of the army and had a position as secretary to a West End club. She told me that she would have been pretty well off but for his extravagance. He was getting $400 a year, and they had no children. She complained that it was her fate to be allied with spendthrifts. Her father had squandered his fortune, and her husband's improvident habits kept her in continual debt and difficulty. It grieved me to see the shabbiness of her surroundings, the squalid lodging-house parlour, without so much as a bunch of flowers or a stand of books to show that it was in the occupation of a lady. There was a cigar-box on the mantelpiece, and there was a heap of newspapers on the sofa, and a pair of shabby slippers inside the fender. It was a room to make one shudder. I asked her if she was reconciled to her father, and she said no. She had heard nothing of him since her marriage. I felt very unhappy about her after we parted at Hungerford Market. I saw her standing on the pavement as the omnibus drove away, a tall, slim figure, distinguished looking in spite of her shabby mantle and rusty black silk gown. I had promised to go and see her again, though I was very seldom at liberty at that time, and I went to Cecil Street 2 or 3 times in the course of the winter, but she was always out, and there was something in the tone of her letters that made me think she did not wish to see me again, though I believe she was fond of me always, poor soul. I saw nothing more of her, and heard nothing until nearly 4 years afterwards, when I was spending an afternoon at Richmond with my pupils, 2 girls of 14 and 16, and I came face to face with her in front of Thompson's seat. She was with a tall, handsome man whom at first I took to be her husband, but there was something in the manner of both of them that impressed me uncomfortably, and I began to fear that this was not her husband. She looked much brighter than when I saw her in Cecil Street, and she was better dressed, very plainly but in excellent taste. She took me aside a little way while her companion stood and talked to the 2 girls. She put her arm through mine in her old caressing way, and then she said abruptly, "I almost wonder that you will speak to me. I thought you would cut me dead." I looked puzzled, no doubt, so she said, "Perhaps you don't know what a lost creature I am. Perhaps you have not heard." I told her I had heard nothing about her since we parted at Hungerford Market, and then she gave a deep sigh, and said, "Well, I am not going to deceive you. That," with a jerk of her head towards the man who was standing with his back to us, "is not my husband, but he and I are bound together for the rest of our lives, and we are perfectly happy together. Society would scorn us and trample upon us, no doubt, if we gave it a chance, but we don't. We live out of the world, and we live for one another. Now, aren't you shocked with me? Don't you want to run away?" she asked, with a little laugh, which sounded as if she were very nearly crying. I told her that I was very sorry for her. I could say no more than that. "You would be sorrier still if you could picture to yourself the miserable life I led before I left my husband," she said. "I bore it for 5 years, years that seemed an eternity. He cared for me no more than for the flower girls in the street. He left me to pine in my dingy lodging, left me to be dunned and worried all day long, left me out at elbows, ashamed of my own shabbiness, while he amused himself at his club, and then he considered himself cruelly used when he found out there was another man in the world who thought me worth caring for, and then I told him I loved that man with all my heart. My leaving him was the impulse of a moment. The moment came when his brutality turned the scale, and I ran out of the house in my despair, and jumped into the first cab I could hail, and drove away to him," pointing to the man in the distance, strolling beside my two gawky girls, "and to happiness. I am a wicked wretch, no doubt, to be happy under such circumstances, but I am, or, at any rate, as happy as anybody can hope to be in this world. There is always a thorn among the flowers," she sighed, as if the thorn was a big one, I thought. "I suppose I shall never see you again," she said. "When we say good bye presently, it will be farewell for ever." I told her that was not inevitable. I was my own mistress, free to choose my friends. I told her that if ever she had need of a friend I would go to her. I felt that I was in some wise answerable for the bad turn her life had taken, for had I been a more judicious counsellor I might have guided her better, might have prevented her coming into collision with her father. I asked her for her address, but she told me she had promised to tell nobody where she lived. "We are living out of the world," she said. "We have no visitors, no friends or acquaintance." She clasped my hands, kissed me, and hurried away to rejoin the man whose name I never learned. He lifted his hat to me and the girls, and they walked away together towards the Star and Garter, leaving us standing by Thompson's seat, staring idly at the landscape in the summer sunlight. I felt dazed as I stood there, looking down into that lovely valley. It had been a terrible shock to me to meet her again under such circumstances.
Chapter 16